Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Herbert Lin. I'm a PhD candidate in theology at the Divinity School, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you today our speaker, Dr. Pamela Sue Anderson. Dr. Anderson is currently Reader in Philosophy of Religion at the University of Oxford, where she's also a Fellow in Philosophy at Regent's Park College, where she also teaches Christian ethics. She's also a member of the Theology faculty and the Women's Studies Committee. She did her graduate work in philosophy at Oxford, where she wrote her dissertation on Kant and Ricoeur under the supervision of Alan Montefiore, a prolific author who has written on a wide range of topics such as natural theology, testimony, and religious epistemology. Dr. Anderson is a well-regarded analytic philosopher whose research focuses on philosophy of religion, feminist philosophy, and European philosophy. In 2009, Dr. Anderson became the first female scholar of philosophy of religion to receive an honorary doctorate from Lund University in Sweden. Dr. Anderson has published and edited several books on gender issues and continental philosophy, some of which include an edited volume, New Topics in Feminist Philosophy of Religion, a co-authored work on Kant and Theology, and most recently, a book entitled Revisioning Gender in Philosophy of Religion, Reason, Love, and Our Epistemic Locatedness. She's currently completing a project in dialogue with Michel Ledov, a forthcoming book that will include an English translation of dialogues with Ledov and other written essays concerning Ledov's account of women in the history of philosophy. Without further ado, let us now welcome Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much, Herbert. He's been a really good ally, getting extra handouts and things like that for me. I'd also like to thank the Marty Martin Center, Miriam, Joshua, Bill Schweiker, and anyone else who has been involved in preparing this conference. It's been really a marvelous occasion. So you've got a handout. I will warn you that some of the quotations are slightly out of order, but you don't always have to look at the quotations, but you can when you're wondering what I've actually said, especially if I start talking quickly. My title is slightly different than on the program. I've just tweaked it a bit. It's Ethical Reflection on God, Making Sense of Things. First section. Introduction, the concept God, metaphysics and ethics. For the title of this paper, I have put inverted commas around God to indicate that my reflection is on a particular conception, that is, a concept of God found in traditional theism. And making sense of things in my subtitle is a reference to the recent work of the Oxford philosopher A.W. Moore in his Cambridge University Press book, The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics, Making Sense of Things, and quite a few quotations will come from Moore. I would take for the purposes of this paper the traditional conception of the theistic God from contemporary Anglo-American philosophy of religion, and more recently it's a concept being debated by analytic theologians as well. I appropriate Moore's conception of a thick ethical concept, which has both descriptive and normative content, in order to account for the traditional theistic God, and especially God's omnibenevolence, as employed in a traditional, or as Bernard Williams says, a hyper-traditional Christian social world. Basically, as a thick ethical concept, God, which is under scrutiny here, is an action-guiding concept. That means it offers a motivating reason for action, and it is also socially located, playing a role within a certain way of making ethical sense of a world. With this, I assume Moore's working definition of metaphysics as the most general attempt to make sense of things, and I apply this to theistic metaphysics. To offer you some indication at the outset concerning how this definition actually works in More's text, I offer a few points which are on your handout, but it's worth me reading them, even if a bit quickly. Metaphysics is the most general attempt to make sense of things. I hope that this definition is broadly in accord with standard uses of the word metaphysics, at least insofar as these are broadly in accord with one another. And I hope that I am singling out something worthy of the attention that I shall be devoting to it in this book. Most general is a superlative. In this context, it selects from among all possible attempts to make sense of things, whatever is at the highest level of generality. And a consequence of this is that there is no denying the possibility of metaphysics. Making sense of things, this is still more, can embrace, on the one hand, finding something that is worth living for, perhaps even finding the meaning of life, and on the other hand, discovering how things work, for instance, by ascertaining the relevant laws of nature. To attempt to make sense of things is necessarily to reflect on one's own activity and to try to make sense in particular of the sense that one makes of things. It is hard when we reflect on the sense that we make of things not to be afflicted by all sorts of doubts about it, as will be evidenced from the beginning of the narrative of the evolution of modern metaphysics. One way in which metaphysics is able to make a difference, and the one that seems the most appropriate and the most exciting, again more, is by providing us with radically new concepts by which to live. When I talk about our living by a concept, I am alluding to the fact that some concepts are action guiding, in the sense that even to use them is to be motivated in a certain way. Unquote. Obviously, this is a potentially contentious view of metaphysics, but I'm assuming it in this paper. In addition, the quotations from More means that he uses concept as a term of art, in that we learn how to live by a concept. And the choice of concept or cluster of concepts, which concerns me today, is that of God with his omniperfect attributes. In fact, I will say more about our engaged or disengaged grasp of concepts further on. But first, I stress that the phrase making sense of things applies to the attempt made by contemporary Christian analytic theologians to understand their life, the things and people in it, in relation to a personal creator God who is without a body, eternal, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient, and free. In my conclusion, I aim to complete this process of making sense of things by urging us to reflect ethically upon our own activity in trying to make sense, in particular, of the sense we make of things. One more analytic philosopher needs mention at this point. The British philosopher Bernard Williams is known for his claim that in ethics, reflection might destroy knowledge. And on your handout, page 2, quotation from footnote 12 goes into this view of Williams a bit more. Today I take Williams' claim and consider how, in traditional theism, ethical reflection makes sense of things, and his own further claim that reflection might destroy a religion. And again, you could see page 2 of your handout, footnote 11 in the quotation that goes with that. In Williams' own words, ethical reflection becomes part of the practice it considers and inherently modifies. Here you will see the influence of Williams on More's book. More especially, what once was a thick ethical concept, a perfectly good, in this case that I'm discussing, a perfectly good and omnipotent God by which we have lived, might, after reflection, no longer guide an agent's action. And I'm not generalizing this, I'm just making it the case for an agent. In fact, the subtitle for this paper today could be about a particular agent, and it would be a question: what is it for a feminist philosopher to reject a thick ethical concept? In this case, a feminist philosopher might find that reflection has destroyed ethical knowledge of perfect goodness, destroying knowledge and what once was her religion, Christian theism. This destruction of traditional theism might go something like this. It's a bit rough. A feminist philosopher of religion reflects on the attributes of the omniperfect personal God. She realizes in particular that God's perfect goodness and power is no longer action guiding for her, and possibly not for other feminist and non-feminist philosophers. That is, omnibenevolence might no longer serve as reasons for her or their actions, even though it did once guide women's actions and ethical activities in a world of Christian theists, where obviously it still guides some women's actions. But after reflection, the feminist philosopher has realized that claims made in the name of the omniperfect God have all too easily been used to justify the right or good on the grounds of his perfect goodness and perfect power. However, at the same time, this omnibenevolent and omnipotent God allowed no possibility for a woman to speak against claims to the good or the right when it came to ratifying centuries of women's innocent suffering on the basis of her sex. The problem, then, is that the assumption of rightness, or even justice and goodness, justified by the normative authority of a thick ethical concept, harms that knower who tries to speak against theistic and sexist assumptions. The sexism here harms a female knower precisely because it is justified on the grounds of the omnipotent authority of an all-good male God. For a rough example, a stereotypical claim is that a woman suffers physically more than a man, as evident in childbirth, simply because she is created by a God. Created by a God, as if women deserve to suffer because of their sex. But obviously, this no longer makes sense of things as far as a certain feminist might be concerned. Most helpful for this feminist philosopher is More's discussion of what it was for Friedrich Nietzsche to reject a concept. This is still in The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics. It was a way for Nietzsche of making sense of things by calling time on something with a history, something which had run its course. More goes on to explain that Nietzsche's rejection of God is a brand of atheism. In his words, it is a break in its time, but not of its time. Again, that's on your handout quotation connected with footnotes 13 and 14. Similarly, I intend to argue that what a feminist is doing in rejecting a concept, in this case God, is one way of making sense of things. It is a break in its time, but not of its time, with a major cultural force in Western civilization. And as I hope to be suggesting here, the cultural force is Christian patriarchy, along with the absolute metaphysics of its anthropomorphized God. Section 2, a feminist philosopher and the death of God. We have all heard of Nietzsche's madman in The Gay Science, who asserted God is dead. But when the madman exclaims, "And we have killed him," not too different from Nietzsche's madman is an account of the death of God for Jean-Paul Sartre. And this is on your handout associated with footnote 14. And I quote, "There are people you might call survivors. Early on, they lost a beloved person, father, friend, or mistress, and their lives are merely the gloomy aftermath of that death. X is a survivor of the death of God, and when one thinks about it, it would seem that our entire age is surviving that death, which X experienced, suffered, and survived. God is dead. We should not understand by that he does not exist, or even that he no longer exists. He is dead. He used to speak to us, and he has fallen silent. We now touch only his corpse," unquote. The crucial thing, again, is that this brand of atheism, in Sartre, who in this is close to Nietzsche, does not depend on a proof that God does not exist. Instead, the death of God is an experience, like a bereavement, which survivors suffer. This is a personal loss, as a loss in making sense, which will require the mourners, for instance Nietzsche, to create sense. Whether by murder or from another cause, God is dead. And in response, it is necessary to write an account of both the life and the relation of an omniperfect personal creator, and so on. I would like to propose that such an account or story might, in fact, tell us what it is for a feminist philosopher to reject a concept of God. This would tell of the God who was not supposed to have a gender, since without a body, which philosophers and theologians nevertheless chose to call him, he, and father, and so he is given a gender. My point here is not so much about gender-exclusive or inclusive language. Instead, remember that to reject a concept is to reject a way of making sense of the world. And in this case, it means rejecting the attempt to make sense of things in terms of a personal creator God, who is free, perfectly good, omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, without a body, yet gendered male. By now, the focus of my paper should be clear. It is a feminist philosopher's rejection of a concept, and especially the attributes of omnibenevolence and omnipotence. This rejection is attempting to make ethical sense of things by accepting the death of that God. This implies a change in metaphysical commitments. Her account on the world no longer needs to depend upon the anthropomorphized, perfectly good and all-powerful creator God. I would also like to try to demonstrate why this new way of making sense of things will require an ethical understanding of how religion can be destroyed by reflection on our knowledge of or belief in God. Moore himself considers carefully the question posed by Bernard Williams in his Nietzschean critique of morality. In Williams' words, and I'm quoting from page 2 of your footnotes 1011, why should religion be judged in terms of ethical understandings that are ranked as more or less sophisticated or mature in secular terms? The answer must be, presumably, that the original crude idea of God as an omnipotent law enforcer was itself gained through a crude ethical understanding. But then, if ethical understanding is going to develop, and if religion is going to understand its own development in relation to that, it seems inevitable that it must come to understand itself as a human construction, unquote. In other words, the concept God, and today's focus, his attributes of perfect goodness and etc., might, upon reflection, be rejected in Williams' terms as elaborated by Moore, and now me, as a thick ethical concept. This means that the theistic concept would no longer be both an action-guiding, that's Williams' phrase, and a world-guided concept, which it once was when our ethical understanding depended on an all-powerful divine lawgiver and law enforcer. To explain roughly, for a concept to be world-guided means that it is capable of expressing knowledge, and in turn the concept would also be action-guiding within that world outlook. This also means the thick ethical concept is vulnerable to reflection. So ethical reflection destroys knowledge when the thick ethical concept no longer expresses knowledge. From the evaluative outlook which had guided, in our case, the theist's action. Of course, the traditional theistic concept of God has more than the normative attributes that I've been harping on about omnibenevolence and omnipotence in particular. As already mentioned, he is described as a person without a body who is eternal, perfectly free, omnipotent, perfectly good, omniscient, and creator of all things. My general concern, God, as just described, encompasses his other attributes, which as predicates form a cluster of concepts traditionally applied to him. The danger of gender bias arises when he becomes the norm for what men claim to be, as if the male gender were universal, as if there were a task to become perfectly, that is, to become a perfect divine man. And here I will resist the alternative of a perfect divine woman, which I have resisted in numerous of my publications. In particular, I reject the Irigarean idea of becoming divine. And so I reject the alternative of becoming a divine man or a divine woman. Section 3, ethical self-understanding and epistemic injustice. With my conception of a feminist philosopher here, I assume that she, or indeed he, would ask questions concerning her human constructions of deity, morality, gender, within philosophy as a humanistic discipline. A focus on human understanding and the human origin of our ethical concepts in theistic religion becomes a critical concern from a feminist philosopher of religion, since these ethical understandings and concepts are precisely what have been most resistant to change. That is, unjust norms of sex and or gender have been resistant to change when sanctioned by God. To my feminist and now Williams-influenced conception of philosophy as a humanist discipline, I would like to add a Kantian Enlightenment concern for humanity. Basically, with Kant, I assume that the most pernicious form of immaturity is religious immaturity. But generally, I employ Kantian rather than strictly Kant's terms in order to include women as much as men in religious maturity. In particular, a feminist philosopher who was informed by Kant's essay, an answer to the question, what is enlightenment, will recognize the urgent need to emerge from self-incurred immaturity. And this is despite the so-called difficulty and danger this emergence would pose for women, or in Kant's own words, the entire fair sex, unquote. Clearly today, emergence from religious immaturity would require emerging from religious bias and ethical justice concerning, in particular, the gendering of humanity. Appropriating Kant for contemporary feminist philosophy of religion means assuming that religious immaturity includes pernicious religious attitudes towards genders, intersection with sexuality, race, and other material and social mechanisms of oppression. In this paper, my argument is not dependent on Nietzsche. Neither do I defend any close study of Nietzsche's atheism. Instead, I'm appropriating for contemporary feminist philosophy the 20th century ethical understanding of Nietzsche developed by Williams, who in turn informs More. Two passages from Williams and More contain my main points of concern, which are worth mentioning again. First, picking up where I left off after the earlier quotation from Williams, he goes on to contend that if the self-understanding of religion is not to be left behind by the ethical consciousness, it has to move in a direction that will destroy religion. The center of the matter does not lie in purely logical questions. In fact, the logical or structural questions about religious ethics, like many other questions about God, are interesting only if you believe in that God. Unquote. I will return to Williams' surprising, perhaps initially shocking claim that reflection will destroy religion. When I return to Williams' equally perplexing claim that reflection can destroy knowledge. Perhaps it is not all religion, since it is not all knowledge, that Williams says is destroyed. One possible response would be to construct new knowledge by creating new thick theological concepts, a task for another paper. Second, I pick up on the relevance for a feminist philosopher, of what following Williams More describes as Nietzsche's brand of atheism. On your handout again, page 3, what Nietzsche is doing is rejecting not a hypothesis, but a concept, a way of making sense of things. The crucial point is that Nietzsche's brand of atheism is not just a piece of abstract metaphysics. It is a break in its time, but not of its time, with a major cultural force, unquote. Notice here, in this quotation, which I've given you probably twice now, how the sense of time changes when we go about making sense of things. The role of time is crucial to my proposal today that we do and can change the way we make sense of things, giving up thick ethical concepts, changing our grasp of facts and norms, roughly from an engaged grasp of a disengaged one. So it's a move from still having the concept, but having it in a disengaged way. These are a critical concern for a feminist philosopher who seeks to break in her time, but not of her time, in our knowledge of sex, gender, and sexual orientation, and also in our pernicious use of religion to enforce social mechanisms of sex, gender, race, oppression. As already mentioned, I'm asking what it is for a feminist to reject a thick ethical concept like God's perfect goodness. My focus remains on a feminist philosopher who finds contemporary analytic philosophy of religion and analytic theology lagging behind the aforementioned analytic philosophers Moore and Williams when it comes to ethical and epistemic issues. Ethical reflection might help us not only to consider what we know, but whether our theistic knowledge has concealed epistemic injustice. Basically, epistemic injustice is when someone is wronged specifically in their capacity as a knower, say in unfair differential treatment of witnesses. For example, there is the well-known case of Tom Robinson, the black man in To Kill a Mockingbird, who is accused and convicted of rape, despite the facts which witnesses give to prove that Tom Robinson could not have raped Myella Ewell. Relevant facts include physical facts about Tom's body, his arm, and also he was not in the right location. In fact, this sort of epistemic injustice is all around us. Now, we could think of more everyday examples, but more generally, feminist philosophers have uncovered the greater epistemic reality of this injustice in the unequal relations of a woman witness to knowledge and how this knowledge is constrained for women by their social and material locatedness. In other words, material and social power give unfair advantages to some men over other men and women for acquiring knowledge and for certain epistemic practices. More precisely, epistemic injustice in its generic form refers to what is unfair about undermining a subject of knowledge. Such epistemic injustice occurs more specifically in the form of testimonial injustice. This form of injustice undermines a speaker in her capacity as a giver of knowledge. In addition, epistemic injustice occurs specifically in the form of hermeneutical injustice. This hermeneutical form undermines a subject in her capacity for intelligible social experience. So not making sense of your life in light of a certain conception of God would be an example. Now, all three forms of epistemic injustice, the generic, testimonial, and hermeneutic injustice, also disable women as subjects who could contest claims to knowledge. Section 4, on rejecting a thick ethical concept, the theistic God. Feminist analytic philosophy has in the past 5 years, I should be few, my eyes, motivated, well, probably in the 5 years is also accurate, some of the most significant work in the epistemic debates of contemporary analytic philosophy, raising political and ethical issues. This work has been philosophically significant in requiring analytic philosophers, and I suggest analytic theologians, to consider their gendered locatedness, and this has meant digging deep into their own assumptions about their concepts and claims to knowledge. The result has been substantial activity at the interface of cognition, ethics, and politics. In turn, this activity is generating new and vital material for the field of epistemology, including the project I have with Chan on ethics of cognition. Admittedly, some of this new material in feminist epistemology and ethics might not be, at least initially, conceptually transparent, and it might be a struggle to get to grips with it. Nevertheless, insofar as change requires confronting epistemic injustice in the field of philosophical theology, we need to be willing to accept the limits of what is conceivable while carving out new terrain for the inconceivable. And if tackling obstacles like pernicious ethical norms, then we need to strive to touch what has been untouchable. Basically, one feminist philosophical challenge to the theistic account of God is to uncover the subjects, speakers, and social experiences of knowledge which have been excluded or missed out of fear or resistance in the field of Christian analytic philosophy of religion. In fact, I contend that the strongest motivation for writing distinctively feminist philosophy of religion is the urgent need to articulate and address epistemic injustice, especially testimonial injustice. Feminist philosophers have worked to tease out the facts and norms which continue to prevent testimonies of many women, as well as some non-privileged men, from being truthfully heard. This includes the testimonies of many uneducated or otherwise disadvantaged women and men. To address testimonial injustice in philosophy of religion requires demonstrating that the social and material locatedness of women and men matters to those philosophers who care about truthfulness and justice. In brief, gender should matter in philosophy and theology. Analytic philosophers, more generally, have become increasingly aware of the epistemic locatedness of their philosophical concepts and their arguments. In turn, this philosophical awareness is a crucial step in awareness of gender bias and epistemic injustice. That is, an awareness of the critical role of feminism in ethical reflection. In other words, feminist analytic philosophy is no longer an oxymoron. So Christian and non-Christian philosophers of religion might also find this new philosophical work challenging their branch of the field. Section 5, Making Sense of Things and Nietzsche's Critiques of Morality. To break some ground for making new ethical sense of things, I have chosen to freely appropriate the philosophical discussions of Nietzsche by both Williams and Moore. I apply neo-Nietzschean critiques of the concept God to the current tradition, but also in philosophy, but also to analytic theology. In one place, Moore himself has described his own contribution to this analytic tradition as conceptual philosophy. In the same spirit, we can focus on new conceptual possibilities and non-conceptual tools, such as the tools of learning a language or concept formation itself. As already stated, especially helpful for this understanding is what it is to reject the theistic concept God. And Moore's critical engagement but with Williams' thick ethical concept, which is where it really arises, as well as the latter's two claims that reflection can destroy knowledge and that reflection will destroy religion, ultimately gives us a way to develop our ethical reflection on theistic knowledge. And I'm interested in how we express certain theistically thick ethical concepts that might lead to the fairly obvious need to give up the distinctiveness of certain theistic predicates. And obviously in philosophy of religion, there's ongoing debates about all these concepts like omnipotence and omnibenevolence, and I'm skating over these very technical debates, but I'm making a more general point about how we understand the knower's different locatedness and how that locatedness impacts on whether omnipotence and omnibenevolence in the first place is of interest to that knower. And once knowledge of these predicates is destroyed, then the rejection of God as the thick ethical concept at the heart of traditional theism becomes the crucial step to a larger social phenomena of normative change from what Williams calls a hyper-traditional society to a critically open social outlook. Thus, it is important for theologians to realize that although a person has reflected on the thick ethical concept of God and has realized that she no longer has the outlook of that concept requires, she can still understand that theistic outlook. So you can still debate with traditional theism. Here I recall the distinction mentioned at the outset between an engaged grasp of a thick ethical concept and a disengaged grasp of that same concept. In other words, like a historian or social scientist, she can understand the outlook even though she no longer shares it. In addition, please note that Williams' claim that in ethics reflection can destroy knowledge does not imply only the evaluative outlook implicit in a thick ethical concept is destroyed, as if the evaluative could be separated from the factual content of the concept. Admittedly, this last point has created much debate and, in fact, confusion. But crucially, the point is there is no mere loss of normativity when you give up a thick ethical concept, because the concept would change insofar as your engaged or disengaged grasp of it, but the normative element would remain. Thus, we cannot separate the evaluative outlook of what more helpfully clarifies as an engaged grasp of a thick ethical concept in order to distinguish this from a disengaged grasp of a concept. Even a disengaged grasp of a thick ethical concept involves both descriptive or factual and evaluative content. Section 6. Okay. I'm going to skate over some of Section 6. And I'm going to skate over William's distinction between thick and thin concepts. You're welcome to ask me a bit about those later if you like. But I'd like to now go to a couple examples of concepts that have been given up. One of the examples I use is the concept of femininity as described by Christine Korsgaard. That's on your handout, page 3. And I quote, "If someone says that aggressiveness is not feminine, the response to him will not be that aggressiveness is feminine or that aggressiveness is great. The response is, let's not talk that way." The complaint that has been launched against the values embodied in the evaluative concept feminine or equally masculine is not that they were false or misleading, but they were straitjackets stunting everybody's growth. It is that people who hold themselves and others to these ideals do not flourish. The concepts, therefore, must be abandoned or revised, unquote. Let us take another example of a thick ethical concept, or perhaps it might also be called a theistically thick ethical concept, that of the lawgiver related to moral obligation, on which a 20th century woman philosopher and Roman Catholic, at least as I understand it, Elizabeth Anscombe, reflected on what she urged her philosophy readers to reflect on. Anscombe concludes that moral obligation has its origin in Christianity. According to her, it relies upon a divine lawgiver, God, as a necessary condition for our use of moral obligation. So, in fact, despite being a Roman Catholic, the analytic philosopher Anscombe claims to reject two concepts. And if you read that quotation, also on the same page 3, footnote 17, I think. Anyway, there you see a very famous quotation that most undergraduates will have read when they've done virtue ethics about giving up obligation or moral obligation because it depends on the divine lawgiver. In the same context of debates in 20th century moral philosophy, Williams argues that morality itself is a peculiar institution with its historically contingent origin in Christianity. In a later context, and with the help of a Nietzschean methodology, Williams writes a genealogical story about the origin of morality in Christianity. In his book, Truth and Truthfulness, an essay on genealogy enables reflection on our knowledge of morality, demonstrating that what we have accepted as morality has relied upon God as an omnipotent lawgiver for what it is to be moral and good. Here, if following Williams' genealogy, reflection destroys knowledge in concluding that morality as a system of obligations is completely contingent on a particular history of Western philosophy, or, if you like, philosophical theology. Now, if we no longer have that moral knowledge, it is more likely that reflection will destroy that religion. At least the Nietzschean genealogy demonstrates that Christianity is not a necessary part of what Williams will call an ethical outlook rather than, and then your ethical concepts rather than morality. Religious, like ethical practice, is vulnerable to reflection. Williams opts for ethics rather than morality. It seems to follow from Williams' Nietzschean genealogy of a concept that the omnipotent lawgiver God, that reflection destroys knowledge, and that it will destroy a religion. Yet we, or some of us, also begin to realize that this use of destroy is not necessarily negative. inasmuch as such destruction is about time changing how we make sense of things. I submit that this negative is in fact liberating when it comes to ethical reflection. A feminist philosopher rejects a concept like an all-powerful, perfectly good law-enforcing God, and she becomes free to try to make sense of gender relations, facts and norms in philosophy and theology in new, hopefully less oppressive ways, or the reflection will continue. Crucially, the feminist philosopher who rejects a concept on sexist grounds will not be tied to contingent and oppressive social and material relations, which have been determined and enforced by an anthropomorphized divine ideal. I won't review the paper. Quite a bit is repetitive, but I will give you my last paragraph. Thus, I'd like to conclude this paper, Ethical Reflection on God, Making Sense of Things, having attempted, in Moore's terms, to reflect on one's own activity by trying to make sense, in particular, of the sense that one makes of things. As Moore also says, one way in which metaphysics is able to make a difference, and the one that seems the most important and the most exciting, is by providing us with radically new concepts by which we live, unquote. So too, for a feminist philosopher, to reject a concept is to begin a truthful account of how we might make sense of things through new concepts which are not constrained by normative gender violence or by an unbridgeable gulf between man and his divine ideal. For an alternative example of a possible concept for debates about God, theologians might turn to a divine which is immanent in life, or we could turn to a suggestion made in Revisioning Gender in Revisioning Gender in Philosophy of Religion, Reason, Love, and Epistemic Locatedness, and I quote myself. On your handout, the last quote, instead of traditional theism, we might discover a form of rationalism which has God or nature as its ground. Then no personal male gender deity is implied here, yet a creative corporality is. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Anderson for her paper, which strikes me as extremely rich and thought-provoking. And it is especially so because I think it brings out a difficulty in reality that we as finite and fallible creatures have to constantly face and struggle with in our everyday lives. The main task of my response is to show what this difficulty is and why it is so important for all of us to realize what it is. The occasion for realizing this difficulty is prompted by the following problematic. What happens when beliefs that once were held to be true and existentially meaningful become obsolete? This seems to me also the problem of value, of how we actually come to understand or to judge something as being morally relevant in our lives. In the case of religious belief, the crisis here is that the concept God may no longer lay claim upon us in guiding our actions, particularly in the wake of Nietzsche's fateful announcement that God is dead. The Christian theologian Paul Van Buren once made the tragic remark that we cannot even understand what Nietzsche means when he says that God is dead, precisely because the word God is dead. It appears that in the midst of secularism and confusion today, the word may no longer mean anything to us. And if words have lost their significance for us, how then can we reclaim or to recover their meaning? Or is it even desirable to do so? Now, I take it that this, in essence, is the problem that Dr. Anderson is trying to address in her paper. What used to be a meaningful action-guiding concept or a thick ethical concept, that is God, who traditionally is conceived to be omnipotent and benevolent and all-knowing, has now shown up to be, after reflective scrutiny, a dead concept, even oppressive, since such an understanding of God allows, quote, no possibility for the woman to speak against claims to the good or the right when it came to rectifying centuries of her innocent suffering on the basis of her sex, unquote. Such a way of making sense of God has led to what we might call metaphysical violence, That is to say, by justifying certain theological ideas on the grounds of an anthropomorphized God, that we are to address God as He, Father, and so on, as if God has a gender just as we do, the female knower, so to speak, finds herself obliged to obey the terms being set by Christian patriarchy, and all this along with the absolute metaphysics of the omnipotent authority of a male God. Consequently, this has led Dr. Anderson to raise the question what it is for a feminist philosopher to reject a thick ethical concept. We should note, however, that the point here about the rejection of a thick ethical concept like God is not so much about gender-exclusive or inclusive language. Rather, and this is where I locate the heart of the issue, Dr. Anderson wants to draw our attention to how concepts, when it delimits or constrains our horizons in a particular way, can in fact misdirect our interests and hence giving rise to unwarranted prejudices. In light of this, to reject a concept, therefore, is to also reject a way of making sense of the world. It is to reject a socially constructed horizon as being definitive for an individual's way of life. The urgency, then, is to revise our metaphysical commitments accordingly, that is, to change our discriminating way of looking at things so as to emancipate disadvantaged men and women from what she calls epistemic injustice, to pave the way from a hyper-traditional society towards a critically open society where claims to knowledge can be subject to earnest interrogation under the climate of intellectual honesty. At this point, we might ask, how are we to do that? In fact, how could we? How could we simply reject a concept that has held sway for so long in the lives of faithful believers? Moreover, did not Jesus himself also refer to God in terms of gendered descriptions, such as, I and the Father are one, whoever has seen me has seen the Father, go baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit? And so, what gives us the right to reject the concept of God, in this case, the notion of the Father Almighty, especially when it is believed to be of divine, that is, of revealed origins, and thereby normative for the religious life? This is where it becomes crucial for us to examine more carefully what Dr. Anderson means by asking what it is for a feminist philosopher to reject a thick ethical concept. First, she does not take her question to be representative of all feminist philosophers or of the feminist philosopher as if there can be such an archetype. What she really wants to know is how the particular individual can come to terms with the personal loss of the meaning of God in her life. God, as understood in a certain sense, can no longer speak to her needs and concerns in the way that it used to do so for the early believers. It is not that she willfully rejects the concept, but that she cannot accept it wholeheartedly, even if she sincerely wants to. It is in this sense that she must learn to accept the death of God for herself. Second, according to Bernard Williams, who was heavily influenced by Wittgenstein, it is possible for an individual to reject a thick ethical concept even if it is deeply entrenched in long-standing traditions, because such an ethical concept might not have resonance for her within the particular form of life that she finds herself in. In a society where sexism runs rampant, it can become increasingly hard for her, and perhaps we might say in an existential way, to accept the patriarchal conception of God as having moral value. And this is a reality not only for certain individuals, but it can happen to any one of us, depending on what the moral crisis might be. I want to illustrate this with a certain example. Here, I think of a person like Ivan Karamazov, who waged a terrible struggle with God. His challenge is this: how can anyone reasonably believe in a benevolent, omnipotent God when there is cruelty to children everywhere? How can God, if you say that he is love, permit such suffering in his own creation? Now, Ivan is not a simple-minded atheist. What he's rejecting is not simply the existence of God. On the contrary, he confesses that he wants to believe in God if only he could, and yet he cannot bring himself to do so. He's almost like the man we see in the gospel who cried out to Jesus to save his demon-possessed son, "I believe, but help my unbelief." But Ivan does not believe, for he just cannot accept the sovereignty of God as such. If this is indeed the kind of God that we have, he says, then so be it. He would rather stick to his suffering and must most respectfully return his ticket. The God of 19th century Russia no longer works for him, and with the rejection of such a God, Ivan has also rejected the world altogether. This is the difficulty that every religious thinker must confront. How do we speak to an Ivan Karamazov, or to a woman who suffers from domestic violence, or for that matter, to anyone who faces trials and tribulations in this world, about God? How can God, as both a religious and a theological concept, take on meaning again in our suffering and broken world? In the midst of all this, can the religious person, when she says that God is love, truly says what she means, but more importantly, also means what she says? How can she persuade the non-believer to come to claim the sense of those words as her own? This, I submit to you, is the difficulty of religious communication. Call this the difficulty of understanding or the difficulty of reality. And it is a difficulty that will not easily go away. Suppose we try to respond to someone like Ivan in the following manner, that even though there's pain and cruelty everywhere, even though as of now it is necessary, as Paul puts it, for the whole of creation to groan in affliction, eventually we trust that God will put things right, and at the end of time he shall wipe clean the tears from every face. But what can such an answer do for someone like Ivan, or for the person who has lost her faith? It will be deemed as empty words, a mock consolation, a deus ex machina, as it were, because in reality, what the suffering person is actually looking for is not how there could be an explanation for the way things are, but whether she can personally make sense of her life in this world, that is in the here and now, in spite of whatever crisis that she might face. If the traditional concept of God can neither help her make sense of things, nor to guide her to live in the way that she finds fulfilling, then nothing you say concerning God will improve the situation. The difficulty that such a person is struggling with, therefore, is not an intellectual issue. It is not something that can be easily addressed simply by coldly explaining the situation in terms of, say, the philosophical problem of theodicy. For to do that would be to deflect the issue altogether. And here the point is not to address the argument, but to address the human person. The root of the difficulty is that certain forms of life, which were once considered meaningful and even empowering, may no longer be possible or available for us today. Is it possible to live like a first-century Christian in the present day? I do not know. Kierkegaard would say that it does not matter whether you are a Christian living in ancient Palestine or a Christian living today in a modern bourgeois society. For the grace of God is available to all of us regardless of time and space, and in a sense, everyone can be contemporaneous with Jesus Christ, that is, to stand in a timeless relationship with him. But again, this begs the question of how someone who is out of touch with such concepts can appropriate them as sensible or life-affirming, to use a phrase from Nietzsche. In any case, this is the predicament that I take Dr. Anderson to be implying in her paper, where she tells us that we may have to write an honest biography of God, to rethink what it would mean for us to speak of God in radically new yet meaningful ways, although she also recognizes that many of us are still not yet ready for it. Not everyone, of course, will agree with Dr. Anderson's diagnosis and recommendation. For one thing, how should we know whether or not we are really talking about the same thing here when we talk about God? Is it true that the Christian form of life, as the church has always conceived it to be, is now dead? Regardless of what the real state of affairs might be, the reality is that the thick ethical concept of God is in danger of losing its religious weight. Ultimately, what I find important about Dr. Anderson's paper is that it not only forces us to see the world as it is with all its injustices and violence, but in the process, we also come to learn something important about ourselves when we reflect upon our concepts, the use of our concepts and practices. The journey towards self-understanding can be a painful one, especially when sometimes we may have to call our own convictions into question. Yet, there is no easy way. Indeed, that is the difficulty, but it is a challenge that we must accept with courage.
Thank you. I guess I'm about as tired as you are of sexist behavior, but I wonder whether you really how much you really want to align yourself with Bernard Williams, this Bernard Williams quote on the second page, because I think I'm just as tired of The Guardian and Williams's snide attitudes towards religion. I mean, he says, well, you know, you have a crude idea of God because you had a crude ethics, but now we have a better, a non-crude idea of ethics, and so we should ditch the crude idea of God. But I think if you think about Aquinas, who was certainly sexist, there's nothing crude about his ethics. Philip Foot, who was allergic to the concept of sin, regularly assigned article after article of Aquinas because she thought his analyses of virtues and vices were so subtle. And I think the idea that somehow sexism or racism or homophobia are products of crude social or ethical systems is false. I mean, you can be sophisticated, you can have a sophisticated and complicated view as you like, and it may still spin off these injustices. And there also seems to be a kind of myth of progress behind Bernard Williams's remarks. I mean, when I think about it, I think, well, certainly our society is sexist, racist, homophobic, and many other things, and certainly Aquinas's was too, but that doesn't mean that there's not something in old societies that, I mean, it seems like different incongruent social systems might spin off different systemic evils, but also have different insights into the truth, you know, so that I might learn something from the Abraham stories, even though I certainly wouldn't want to live in his society. So I just wonder whether you need to associate your project with that sort of remark, like that sort of quote.
Yes, thank you very much. Part of the difficulty here as well, and thinking of what you're saying about Aquinas and all your own work, Marilyn.
I don't work on Aquinas, but I...
No, but all your work on, the other medieval thinkers. I mean, first of all, obviously this is, in part, an Enlightenment project that I located this discussion in, because Moore's work is on modern metaphysics, so that's one thing. But on the other hand, I'm not actually rejecting all the history of philosophy before the Enlightenment. That's not what I'm on about here. I guess I have taken Williams' account not because I thought it represented all the ways in which Christians have talked about ethical understanding, but because of the ways in which I think sexist Christians are often very, very crude in how they talk about women.
Not about women, but that doesn't mean the system out of which that comes is crude, you know. I mean, in other words, I think that it might lead us into self-deception to think of, now we have a modern society, and so it's not going to spin off any oppressive whatevers and so on. And we can reconceive God or nature or whatever it is that way. I mean, that also would be self-deception.
But I'm not proposing I'm not actually proposing a modern conception either. I mean, I'm not saying that what we might come up with won't look like some of what you find in Aquinas. That's fine. But what I'm saying is the project that has no room for other discussions of God and God's attributes, or other discussions, maybe just even of religion, is what I was tackling here. So it shouldn't be read as a rejection of all the history of philosophy and theology, but I am attempting to reject a core conception that doesn't work with the issues we're trying to address when we're trying to address contemporary uses of philosophical concepts that are sort of abstracted from concrete reality. As if we talk about something that's more abstract, it doesn't matter about concrete reality. I mean, I suppose one of the examples in the paper that I was implying was that people can go right along debating the attributes and saying, ah, well, this God is engendered. But in the next second, all their examples and all their uses of God reduce God to something that gives them power over everybody else who doesn't believe that or doesn't hold that concept. So I think I am trying to tackle a very contemporary smugness about philosophy of religion, but I'm not trying to reject the whole history of philosophy, because as my students, I have them read past texts, but maybe I'm having them read them in ways that are initially disengaged. Now they may become Ptolemaists, or they may become Kantians, that's fine, but I'm asking them to think quite carefully in reflecting on the way they use their concepts as to whether there are implicit in them, in the debates, certain forms of epistemic injustice.
You know, you might think that an omnipotent lawgiver would command equal wages for men and women. You know?
Yes, you might.
It depends.
You might. But when
the omnipotent lawgiver
yes.
by itself doesn't give you the bad result. It's other things.
No, it's the man who thinks he is actually that God. That, you know, when he's arguing on that basis, he thinks he's got the right to.
He needs to go to confession.
Yes, probably does. I take that point. Yes.
Professor Clark?
Thank you very much for the lively paper. I'm wondering if the whole notion of a concept that's action guiding isn't hermeneutically underdetermined.
Okay.
That is to say, I can imagine we can probably find historical examples where oppressed people took incredible meaning out of the omni-God and used it as a way of critiquing one situation. In the same way, the particular philosophical conception of the divine that you're working on would need to be embedded in larger patterns of discourse, including those that would criticize from theistic grounds that conception.
Yes.
And so I don't see how one particular idea is ever action guiding to the extent that you want to suggest. I'm just not sure that human action is that easily directed or determined.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's right. If you just took one concept. But I think the question that I'm raising is actually quite specifically located. It's in a particular tradition in which that concept dominates, and I'm suggesting it should be given up. But you're absolutely right. If we were in a different social or intellectual world, we might have a different concept of God, of course.
Or the same concept.
Or the same concept, yes.
Actions.
Yes. So you could actually use, say, Spinoza's. I mean, one of the things I'm implying here is I'm quite interested in Spinoza's conception of God. And I'm quite interested in alternative tradition, which goes back to Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, Deleuze, this tradition, which is more about eminent things in life. But I also know I've run a danger here in treating a concept, God, as just a concept, because really there was much more implied in it. Whereas normally the concepts that are discussed by Williams, or indeed Korsgaard, here in the example, are a simple thing like femininity, which has been a straitjacket, or indeed blasphemy, chastity. But, you know, we could have a new concept like life's integrity. But that's what I'm asking for, more conversation, because I think one of the things that happens in an academic circle is that when you're in one circle, you have to use one set of concepts. When you're in another circle, and I find it quite schizophrenic, to be totally honest, because, you know, when I'm with this group, you know, okay, we're talking about regret. When I'm with this group, we're talking about a concept of something else. But this was an example of a concept that has been given more and more power economically by funding that supports research in this area and other things. And, you know, I suppose this is the context in which I located that. But thanks, yeah. Hermeneutically, there could be lots of concepts that need to be.
I just want to tell you that it looks like in the Catholic Church there is, of course, the Blessed Virgin, Holy Mary,
Yes.
who rises above anything and who people implore in times of hard human faith. And
Yes.
are granted, believe they are granted redemption and cure from their ills. And of course there is Lourdes and
Yes.
Guadalupe.
Yes.
And that for this, I think, was in the 19th century, just when feminism sort of came into play. So this was possibly one way again to affirm the Holy Virgin Mary's status.
Yes.
And to emphasize some kind of feminist things. The other things of feminist aggressiveness, there was Teresa of Avila, and of course Catherine of Siena, who took the Pope from Avignon and put him back into Rome. So there is some, so Catholicism is not free of feminism, especially since Holy Mary just about has the status of a super deity that you can turn to in all your troubles.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't know if everyone heard that, but she was asking about the Virgin Mary and the way in which the Virgin Mary has been used not only in the past Catholic tradition, but it's on the rise in current Catholic traditions as a form of a woman who you can appeal to in times of suffering, and it's a feminist concept. Yes, I mean, there are plenty of feminist theologians who are very interested in drawing on female texts and issues of gender being represented by the Virgin Mary and giving comfort. And in fact, one of the women who I mentioned in here, Lucy Rigore, her idea of feminist theology is all bound up with the role of Virgin Mary. I don't see anything wrong with people make sense of their lives through that. I don't have any objection. I don't find personally that all that helpful. But the other problem is, in this area that I'm discussing, analytic philosophy of religion, Mary will never be a topic of discussion.
Thank you so much for that talk. I found it really quite interesting and also very compelling. I'm wondering if I can come back very briefly to Professor Schweiker's question.
Okay.
And to pose what I take to be a similar kind of question. Because what I was struck by in the paper is not only the reference to Williams, but also not only the reference to Williams, but also your citation from Jean-Paul Sartre, which is on, if I'm not mistaken, Georges Bataille, the new mystic, in that essay.
Yes, that's Georges Bataille, yes.
Okay, so I think of when, we see the quote, X experienced, suffered, and survived the death of God, is actually Georges Bataille. Right? And so if that's the case, then it strikes me that in aligning, or in taking that experience as a paradigm, then one of the quite interesting moves on your part, and also quite, I think, provocative moves on your part, is then to defend this idea of God as an actually motivating concept in that Kantian model. Because, of course, in Bataille's move, in the Theological Summa, one could argue that the ethical category, the ethical import of those concepts is perhaps either you get rid of it totally, or it's so transformed that it's difficult to live with.
Yes.
So then the question becomes, in what sense you can have the concept of God as an action-motivating concept while also giving up the idea of an absolute lawgiver or an absolute ruler of God.
Yes.
Insofar as in the Kantian tradition, the idea of the concept of God as a motivating action is precisely tied to this idea of absolute law.
In the Kantian tradition?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't agree with that.
Okay, well, I
mean, in the sense of a divine law, I do agree with it in Kant uses the moral law, but if you were here when John Hare gave his paper, I did raise questions.
I see, fair enough. I guess I'm thinking of the metaphysics of morals, where it says the only way in which we have of understanding how a rule can be absolutely binding is by analogy.
Yes, it's an analogy, but it's an as if. It's not.
Fair.
Yeah.
So this is all to ask if you can sort of unpack how you keep the idea as action motivating and give up the idea of a ruler God. And I think when you said that stuff about Deleuze and Spinoza, you're going in that direction. But
yes.
I was wondering if you could unpack that.
Yes. No, thank you very much. Yes, you picked up a subtext, absolutely. I have become very, very interested in what they call the alternative tradition, which is Spinoza, Nietzsche and Bergson, and into the French tradition, and I've been looking at other notions of at least mysticism coming through. So what I would suggest is that, if you give up a particular concept of God, it doesn't mean that you won't tweak that old concept. It depends on how you're trying to make sense. But tweak it in such a way that you begin to make sense again of things. And I mean, personally, I think less otherworldly concepts of God are much more attractive. The Sartre quotation too reflects a growing interest amongst some of my postgraduates, using Bataille, and there's been some marvelous work, I know, on Merleau-Ponty done on Augustine in creation and that. So, I am open to new concepts for God action, because I think we always have to have, concepts which make sense of what we're doing, and then, multiple concepts. So yeah, thank you. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I shared the question. Sure.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
So this is a question that starts from Ms. Anscombe.
Okay, good. Yes. Okay.
So what she's doing, I think, is to try to establish a certain conceptual connection between obligation and an obligator, a divine obligator. She's not actually rejecting the obligator. In fact, I think what she's saying to her contemporaries is, if you reject the obligator, then you should also reject the obligation. Now, what I want to ask you is, if you're going to agree to that, are you going to agree with Bernard Williams, who wants to reject the notion that there are obligations that we have, whatever our personal projects are? So, Williams's position is anti-enlightenment. You're using him within an enlightenment project, and I think there's a tension there.
Good. Yes. Two things, yes. I skirted over the Anscombe because I was losing time. But you're absolutely right. She still has, because of her background in Catholicism, a lawgiver, and you're right. If you read Anscombe alongside Williams, they do not agree. And I was siding with Williams and not with Anscombe in that particular case, because I was arguing that in these debates which were had amongst the Anscombes and the Williams, in that little book edited by Chris, I think you get a really nice feel of what's going on in the earlier part of the 20th century in debates which they now call virtue ethics, that people were trying to work out how to deal with modern moral theory without a God, and, do we just hold on to Kantianism and deontology? But as you said to me the other day, I've got a lot I can say about Kant and the Enlightenment in this regard. But I think when it comes to Williams and Anscombe, I'm definitely on Williams' side and not on Anscombe's side. But I wanted to bring in Anscombe because she is somebody who is equally thought of as Catholic and as an ethical philosopher. So that's partly why I brought her in, but I agree it was skating over. Now, the way in which I tried to get around some of the Kantian things, and again, this is work in progress. I mean, to be fair, I need to direct you to read both Noble in Reason and Infinite in Faculty and the Evolution of Modern Metaphysics. I think A.W. Moore is brilliant, and he's very much using Kant, and he's very much using Bernard Williams. Now, it's Moore that made me become intrigued with Williams, because I'm myself Kantian, and I have been for most of my adult life. But I'm challenged by Williams and Moore's use of Williams, and I think it's a really important challenge, because I think some of the ways in which we hold on to a Kantian sense of obligation can be deeply problematic. But that, I mean, that's a whole other story. But I want to be my own person here and say, I'm challenged by Williams and Moore in my position as a Kantian. I've been caused to rethink what I think about moral obligation, divine lawgivers, and how I'm making sense of my life. And I'm saying, why am I being schizophrenic and trying to do more things than need be? So in some ways you might say this is work in progress. But I think where I'll end up is I still think I'm an Enlightenment thinker, so I still think I will have a modified Kantianism. I mean, Moore has a really interesting article on Kantian maxims as thick ethical concepts, and I'm really attracted by that. So, I mean, I could talk to you about that later, but thank you, you're right, you picked up inconsistencies that I'm aware of, but I think there are inconsistencies I'm interested in struggling with in order to move away from a position on Kant that might be far too formalist.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating paper. I realize as an analytic philosopher of religion, we were talking about, among other things, different moments in judging an ethically fit conception of God. Rejecting, becoming unhappy with it, rejecting one conception for various reasons, and moving to the possibility of either finding a better sense-making conception of God, or indeed deciding that there are no conceptions of God that make sense at all. Yeah. And that you were not necessarily doing a genealogy of that. But I'm curious to know whether you think your analysis would be either challenged or enriched by thinking about how those moments might play out and how your analysis might be affected. If you consider the fact that those two moments may be going on at least partly at the same time, and if they would be challenged, if your analysis would be challenged and enriched, how would it be?
So the two moments are what I'm doing right now with analytic philosophy of religion, is that what you're saying? And then maybe another account that would be a new account?
A new account, better sense.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, as some of you might imagine, I actually teach analytic philosophy of religion, and I don't do anything with feminism when I teach it, because that's part of the syllabus. So I can do that in a quite disengaged way and use the concepts. That's not a problem. But I think it's really students that have led me to start thinking, ooh, and actually possibly other feminists who I tend to disagree with, but just start thinking of a new genealogy that I would find more comfortable, rather than just doing, teaching that's fairly disengaged, to find something that I would be more deeply committed to. So does that kind of make sense? Or do you want me to say what kind of concepts I would think up, or what I don't? Yeah.
I'm really asking about the process of rejecting one ethically fit conception of God, while at the same time searching for some alternative or maybe no alternative conception.
Yeah, it might not happen exactly that way. Like there's one moment you just sit down and decide, I'm going to give that up. It doesn't. 30 or 40 years later, you might say, well, why am I living a schizophrenic life? That might be. Or you might slowly be giving up one thing because you think, well, look at the richness of Bataille, or look at this richness. I didn't know you could have a form of mysticism that motivated practical action. And there's lots of interest in the UK in looking at questions about the philosophy of life and eminent transcendence, or transcendence incarnate. And I'm intrigued by that. And there's a lot of interest in Adrian Moore's book, A.W. Moore's book. I never thought I'd be interested in metaphysics, and it's just a fabulous book. I recommend it to you. I think it's really Moore's book that made me think, look, I had no idea you could read Deleuze and Quine, write a doctorate on Quine and use Deleuze. It's fabulous. And Bergson, doing something in his work on Bergson. And I think philosophers of religion, especially in the analytic tradition, are losing out if they don't open their eyes to what other things are going on in analytic philosophy. So I think that's where I'm at. And I'm being challenged by people like Moore. And Williams, obviously, I would probably never use Williams if Moore hadn't.
I think we can have one or two more questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering whether you could say a bit more about what you thought the nature of our ethical relation to the rejection of certain concepts is.
Yeah, for our ethics of cognition, you mean?
Exactly, because hearing your paper has been putting me into the question. In particular, I was wondering whether you would put it in terms of there being something like a moral duty to reject certain concepts, or whether there would have to be a different way of thinking about the essence of that rejection.
I don't think I want to make it a duty for someone. I don't want anyone to give up a theistic concept of God if they don't want to. That's not a problem. As I say, I teach analytic philosophy of religion, whatever else. But when it comes to our ethics of cognition, I am really, really interested in how much, like with our interest in self-deception and that, how much we in our cognition assume things that are really going against what we really hold as, sense-making or not. So, but I don't want to say we should have a duty to give up a concept, certainly not. But I think we have a duty to reflect. And that was kind of why, because John and I are working on a project in ethics cognition, and we did something on the transgender woman, and I was trying to get us to reflect about our own sort of assumptions and self-deception that might be involved in our own forms of sexism and that. And so that, I think, but I don't want to make it a duty to give up a concept. Nobody has to give up a concept if it's action guiding. You still live with people if but I think I'm interested. Herbert's paper was quite interesting. He took it a different direction. But he's saying, to be a bit more honest about your struggle to understand yourself in the context of a social world. So maybe I wanted to focus a bit more on self-understanding and reflection.
We have one more question on
Thank you, Jan. I know you. Thank you.
Okay, just that, is it me or someone?
No, it is Marilyn. No, thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
no, just, are you sure you don't think people have an obligation to give up on a concept of white supremacy?
Oh, yes, I do. I do, yes. But I don't think they have an obligation to give up God. Sorry, yeah. So if white supremacy is your thick ethical concept, but in the context of ethics of cognition, we're not just going to be targeting extreme racism or sexism. We're trying to look at the theoretical level. Sorry, I do
there's
understand,
a whole
yes.
way of being in the world that went with racial segregation and apartheid, different ways. And, I'd be inclined to say, we had an obligation to give them up, and we still have an obligation to keep giving them up.
Yeah. Well, maybe we have to work out a sort of hierarchy of concepts, because some concepts that are quite abstract, like God, but also, would I tell someone they have to give up natural kinds or that? But you're right, when it's a pernicious concept or a pernicious view, maybe what I want people to do is to persuade them to give it up without saying you must give it up. I'm not quite sure if I have to think about whether I want to say.
I think this marks the end of our session, and thank you for coming, and let us put our hands together for Dr. Anderson.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.